The choice that changed everything. Jack Henderson's hands gripped the steering wheel of his rusted pickup truck as he made his way through the winding roads of Maplewood, a small town nestled between rolling hills and thick pine forests. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, stretching across the road ahead like the doubts gnawing at his mind. 52 years old, a widower, a contractor who had spent the last 3 decades fixing homes, yet never quite making one for himself. That was Jack Henderson. But today, everything was about to change. He glanced at the worn manila envelope resting on the passenger seat, the adoption papers. Inside were the names of 3 boys, Noah, Kyle, and Martin Turner, 3 brothers whose world had been shattered in an instant. They had lost their parents in a devastating car accident just 2 months ago. Jack still remembered the moment he heard about it. The radio murmuring the morning news, the voice of a newscaster too calm for such a tragedy. They were just kids, and the world had decided they were alone. Jack had met them by chance. The Turners had hired him to renovate their family's kitchen. He had spent weeks in their home, hammering, sawing, sanding, but more than that, talking. The boys had watched him work with curious eyes. Noah, the eldest at 10, always asking questions. Why do you sand before painting? Or how do you make the cuts so straight? Kyle, at 8, had been the bold one, always eager to hold a hammer or test his strength by carrying tools too heavy for him. And Martin, just 7, had been shy but sweet, often sitting cross-legged on the floor drawing pictures of houses, each one labeled home. Then the accident happened. Jack had stood at the back of the funeral, watching the 3 boys cling to each other in front of their parents' caskets. Noah was stone-faced, trying to be strong for his brothers, while Kyle's restless energy had disappeared, leaving him eerily silent. Martin had buried his face in Noah's sleeve, shoulders trembling as he cried. They had no one. No grandparents. No aunts or uncles willing to take them in. Just the cold, impersonal system of social services waiting to swallow them whole. Jack didn't know when the decision had been made. Maybe it was at the funeral, or maybe the moment he realized no one else would step forward. But what he did know was that he couldn't stand by and watch them be separated into different foster homes. He had never been a father, but he had been a husband. Once. His late wife, Melinda, had always dreamed of having children. She had talked about it in the quiet hours of the night, when the world felt smaller and love felt infinite. But life had been cruel. Melinda's body was never able to carry a child, and their dream had slowly faded into silent acceptance. If she were alive today, she would have told him to do this. She would have loved these boys. Jack sighed, rubbing a rough hand over his face as he pulled into the parking lot of the Maplewood Child Services office. He was met with stares the moment he walked in. Not from the children, from the adults. A single white man, an aging contractor with calloused hands and dust-covered boots, adopting 3 black boys. It wasn't something the town had ever seen. But Jack wasn't here to be understood. He was here for the only 3 people who mattered. A home, not just a house. Noah, Kyle, and Martin sat on a stiff blue couch in the social worker's office when Jack entered. Their small backpacks were clutched in their laps like lifelines, their faces unreadable. Jack swallowed hard. The words he had practiced in his head felt heavy now, too big to say. Instead, he dropped down to one knee, leveling himself with them. "Hey, boys." His voice was rough, but gentle. "It's time to go home." Kyle was the first to react, his fingers tightening around the strap of his backpack. "All of us." His voice was cautious, like he didn't quite believe it. Jack nodded firmly. "All of you." Noah's brown eyes locked onto Jack's, searching, questioning. He had already learned, far too young, not to trust what people said, only what they did. "You really want all of us?" Jack felt something in his chest crack. "Yeah, kid." His voice came out softer than he expected. "I really do." Noah didn't cry, but his shoulders slumped with relief. Kyle sucked in a shaky breath, blinking quickly, as if fighting off emotions he didn't want to show. Martin. Martin stood up first, and then, without a word, the youngest boy wrapped his small arms around Jack's neck. For the first time in months, Jack Henderson felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt since Melinda was alive. Family. The whispers begin. Jack's old two-story house had never felt lonely before. But now, with 3 extra sets of footsteps echoing through its halls, it felt alive. The boys were cautious at first. They moved like guests, sitting carefully on the couch, hesitating before opening the fridge, whispering to each other at night, like they weren't sure if this was real. The town made sure they felt that way too. By the end of the week, the whispers had started. What was he thinking? A white man raising 3 black boys. That's just unnatural. He's just trying to prove something. They'll never fit in here. It was in the grocery store, where the cashier didn't meet his eyes when she rang up their groceries. It was in church, where Mrs. Aldridge clutched her pearls a little tighter when she saw them walk in. It was in the silence of neighbors who had once greeted Jack with warmth, but now crossed the street when they saw him coming. Jack had expected it, but he hadn't expected how much it would hurt. He hadn't expected the way Kyle's fingers would tighten around his belt loop in public places, as if needing the reassurance that Jack wouldn't leave. Or the way Noah's jaw would clench whenever he heard the whispers. Or the way Martin would press his small face against Jack's chest every night, like he was afraid of waking up somewhere else. Jack had built houses his entire life. But he knew now, this wasn't just about giving them a roof over their heads. This was about building something unshakable. A home, a family, a future. And no amount of whispers was going to take that from them. The weight of the world. Jack always knew small towns had long memories. People clung to their traditions and their way of life like a well-worn quilt, stitched together with generations of sameness. Change wasn't just difficult. It was unwelcome. But he hadn't expected the sheer force of resistance he and the boys would face. Not in Maplewood. Not in his town. The silent war. Jack didn't hear the insults to his face. No one had the guts to say it outright. Instead, it came in quiet refusals and lingering stares. It started small. When he walked into the local hardware store, where he had been a loyal customer for 20 years, the usual friendly greeting was gone. "Hey, Bill," Jack said to the owner as he placed a bundle of wood on the counter. Bill barely looked at him. "That all?" Jack raised an eyebrow. "Yeah. Need it for the boys' rooms. Building some shelves." Bill's hand stilled over the register for half a second before his mouth twisted. "That's so." Jack felt the change in the air, the unspoken words, the questions behind Bill's narrowed gaze. "You really think you can raise them right?" Bill muttered, scanning the wood. "I mean, no offense, Jack, but they're different from you." Jack's jaw clenched. He had spent his entire life working with his hands. He knew what pressure felt like, what weight a structure could bear before it broke. But this pressure was something else entirely. "They're kids," Jack said flatly, "and kids need a home." Bill just shook his head and handed him his receipt. No good luck. No see you next time. Just silence. Jack felt the shift everywhere. At the grocery store, the cashier took her time scanning each item, as if he and the boys weren't standing there at all. At church, Mrs. Aldridge, the same woman who used to invite him to every potluck, wouldn't meet his eyes. At the local diner, where he had eaten breakfast every Saturday morning for 2 decades, his usual booth was suddenly reserved. The town wasn't outright rejecting him. They were waiting for him to fail. "You're not wanted here." Jack didn't tell the boys about what was happening. They had enough to deal with. Adjusting to a new life wasn't easy, especially when the world was waiting for you to fall apart. Kyle was the first to notice. "Why does everyone stare at us?" he asked one afternoon as they sat at the kitchen table, eating grilled cheese sandwiches. Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow sip of his coffee, buying time. "I don't know, Bud," he said finally. "Maybe they're just not used to seeing us together yet." Kyle looked down at his plate, picking at the crust. "They don't like it." Jack sighed. "Kids sought everything." "You don't gotta worry about them," he said, nudging Kyle's arm playfully. "You just gotta worry about being a kid." Kyle gave him a look. "I haven't felt like a kid in a long time." Jack's chest tightened. He reached over, ruffling the boy's curls. "Well, let's fix that." That weekend, he took them to the park. It was something simple, something normal. The kind of thing fathers did with their sons. Or at least, that's what Jack thought. When they arrived, it was like stepping onto a battlefield. The parents, ones Jack had known for years, watched them. Their eyes tracked every step, their murmurs cutting through the air like knives. Jack ignored it. He led the boys toward the swings, toward the slides, toward a fresh start. Kyle and Martin hesitated, but Noah had been watching the other kids, the ones who had stopped playing when they arrived, the ones whose parents had whispered in their ears before calling them away. Noah was smart, too smart. "They don't want us here," he said quietly. Jack's stomach dropped. He looked around, at the benches where the parents sat, at the children now playing farther away, at the way his son stood in the middle of it all, alone. Jack had never felt rage like this. He had fought through loss. He had battled loneliness. But nothing hurt like seeing his boys realize they were being pushed out, pushed aside, like they were less. Jack crouched in front of them, keeping his voice steady. "You belong here," he said, "and we don't run just because people want us to." The boys hesitated. But then Kyle, brave and bold, stepped forward. He climbed onto the swings. Martin, watching his brother, climbed up next to him. And Noah took the basketball from under his arm and walked toward the court. He didn't look at the other kids. He didn't wait for permission. He just played. Jack sat on a nearby bench, watching as his sons pushed through the silence. And when the first giggle escaped Martin's lips, Jack smiled, because no matter how hard this town tried, his boys were going to be okay. The warning. But Maplewood wasn't done with them yet. One night, long after the boys had gone to bed, Jack stepped outside for some air. The town felt different at night, quieter, emptier. And that's when he saw it. Spray painted across his garage door, in thick, black letters, were 3 words that made his blood run cold. "Go back home." Jack stood there for a long moment, his hands clenched into fists, his breath slow and steady. Then, without a word, he walked to his truck, pulled out a can of white paint, and got to work. Stroke by stroke, he erased the hate. But the memory would not be so easy to wipe away. Jack knew now, this wasn't just about raising 3 boys. This was about fighting for them. Because if he let this town scare him off, then what chance did his sons have? And Jack Henderson, he wasn't going anywhere. A line in the sand. Jack Henderson had spent his whole life building things. Houses, fences, porches. But now, he wasn't just building a home. He was building a family in a town that wanted to tear it down. The walls around them. The spray paint was gone. But the damage remained. Jack woke up earlier now. Every morning, he checked the yard, the garage door, the mailbox, making sure nothing else had been left behind. The boys never said it out loud, but they felt it too. Martin, once excited about school, began dragging his feet in the mornings. Kyle, usually so full of energy, grew quieter. And Noah never let his guard down anymore. He had always been the most serious of the 3, but now there was something else in his eyes, a wariness that hadn't been there before. They were always waiting for something to happen. And when you lived like that, you never felt safe. The incident at school. Jack got the call on a Tuesday afternoon. "Mr. Henderson, you need to come to the school." It was the principal's voice. Tight. Uncomfortable. Jack's stomach dropped. He rushed out the door, speeding through town toward Maplewood Elementary. When he arrived, he was met with silence. The receptionist wouldn't look him in the eye. Parents standing in the hallway whispered as he walked past. And when he stepped into the office, he saw Noah sitting there. His lip was split. His knuckles were red. And beside him, a boy Jack didn't recognize, curled up in his chair, crying. The principal, Mr. Warner, cleared his throat. Noah got into a fight. Jack's hands tightened into fists. What happened? The principal hesitated. Then another voice cut in. He called us animals. Noah's voice was sharp, his jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. He said we didn't belong here. Jack turned to the boy in the other chair. He looked like every other kid in Maplewood. Blonde hair, freckles, privileged. Jack exhaled slowly. He had prepared for this, but it still hurt. Noah, he said, voice steady. What else happened? Noah was silent for a long time. Then he lifted his hands. His fingers curled like he was still gripping something. A rope. Jack's stomach turned to ice. They put a noose in my locker. The room went still. Jack felt his chest tighten, rage rising inside him like a storm. And when he turned back to the principal, he saw it. The hesitation, the fear of addressing it. The school didn't want trouble. They'd wanted this to disappear. But Jack Henderson, he wasn't going to let that happen. The demand for justice. Jack leaned forward, his voice low but strong. You're going to expel them. The principal's mouth opened, closed. Now, Jack, we have to consider. Jack slammed his hand on the desk, startling everyone. You listen to me. His voice was steady, but inside, he was barely containing his rage. This isn't just some stupid prank. This is hate. And if you don't do something about it, I will. Silence. The principal shifted. Then, slowly, he nodded. The boy will be suspended. Not enough, but a start. Jack turned to Noah. His son's eyes were dark, unreadable. And for the first time, Jack wondered if he was already too late. The breaking point. That night, Jack found Noah sitting in the garage. The boy was quiet, staring at the old wooden workbench Jack had built years ago. Jack pulled up a stool beside him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, I don't want to go back. Jack's breath hitched. I know, son. Noah turned to him then, his eyes burning. They don't want us here. Jack's hands clenched into fists. Because Noah was right. And he hated that. Hated that his son had already learned this lesson. That the world had already tried to beat it into him. You belong here. Noah's jaw tightened. Do we? Jack didn't have an answer. Not yet. But he knew one thing. They weren't running. The basketball game that changed everything. The next day, Jack did something nobody expected. He drove straight to the school, walked right into the main office and asked for the principal. Then he made a demand. I want to coach the basketball team. The principal looked stunned. Jack just crossed his arms. You need a new coach. The last one quit, right? Well, I'm stepping in. Mr. Warner blinked. Jack, this might not be. I'm not asking. Jack had built homes. Now he was going to build a team. Because Noah needed to fight back. But not with his fists. With something bigger. The principal hesitated. Then he sighed, nodded. And just like that, Jack Henderson became the coach of Maplewood's basketball team. The first practice. The gym smelled like sweat and cheap rubber sneakers. Jack stood in front of 10 boys, arms crossed. Some rolled their eyes. Some whispered. But Noah stood tall. Jack took a deep breath. This was it. Their fight wasn't over. But today they were stepping onto the court. Because if this town was going to push them out, then Jack and his boys, they were going to push right back. The court of redemption. Jack Henderson had spent his life building things with his hands: homes, furniture, bridges between people. But this was different. He wasn't just building a basketball team. He was building a legacy. A legacy that would prove his boys belonged. A legacy that would force the town of Maplewood to see them as more than just outsiders. And if they weren't ready, Jack was damn sure going to make them. The first practice. Jack stood in the middle of the gym, hands on his hips, staring at the group of boys gathered before him. Most of them were reluctant. Some had been pushed into playing by their parents. Others were there simply because there was nothing else to do in this town. And then there was Noah. He wasn't just here to play. He was here to prove something. Jack could see it in the way he held himself, his shoulders squared, his jaw set. He wasn't just fighting to be on this team. He was fighting for his place in this town. Jack took a deep breath, glancing over the group of boys. Then he clapped his hands together. "All right, listen up. My name's Jack Henderson, and I'm your new coach." Silence. A few of the boys exchanged glances. One of them, a tall kid with blonde hair named Tommy Peterson, rolled his eyes. Jack ignored it. He wasn't here to make friends. He was here to make winners. I don't care how good you think you are. I don't care if you've never touched a basketball in your life. If you show up, you work. And if you work, you play. His eyes landed on Noah, who met his gaze with a sharp nod. Jack continued, "I'll make one thing clear right now. This team. It isn't about who you are. It's about what you do. So if any of you think you're better than someone else, just because your family's been here longer." His eyes flicked to Tommy, who shifted uncomfortably. "You can leave right now." Silence. Then, slowly, Tommy crossed his arms and muttered, "Whatever. Let's just play." Jack didn't let it slide. He turned on his heel, grabbing a basketball and tossing it straight at Tommy's chest. The boy barely caught it in time. Jack tilted his head. "All right, hotshot. You want to play. You and Noah. One-on-one. Right now." Noah stiffened. Tommy scoffed. "Seriously?" Jack just raised an eyebrow. Tommy shrugged and walked onto the court, spinning the ball in his hands. "Fine. This'll be quick." Jack turned to Noah. "You ready, son?" Noah nodded once. And then the game began. The game that changed everything. It was brutal. Tommy played like a kid who had never been challenged before. He was fast, tall, and cocky. But Noah played like a boy with something to prove. He was smaller, but faster. He dodged, spun, and drove through every gap Tommy left open. Every time Tommy shoved him, Noah got right back up. Every time he missed a shot, he adjusted and tried again. And when Tommy tried to dunk on him, tried to humiliate him in front of the team, Noah stole the ball right out of his hands. Jack had never been prouder. The other boys watched in stunned silence. By the time the game ended, Noah had won. Tommy, red-faced and breathless, threw the ball across the gym. "This is stupid," he muttered. Jack stepped forward, staring him down. "What's stupid, Tommy? Losing to a kid you thought wasn't good enough?" Tommy had no answer. Jack nodded. "That's what I thought." Then he turned back to the team. "Practice is over." As the boys grabbed their bags, Jack watched Noah walk toward the locker room, shoulders straight, head high. Kyle and Martin ran up to him, beaming. "Dude, you destroyed him," Kyle laughed. Noah didn't smile. Instead, he just said, "They respect me now." Jack watched as his son walked away. And for the first time, he wasn't so sure that was a good thing. The breaking point. The next few weeks were tough. Jack pushed them hard. Running drills, practicing plays, teaching them to work as a team, not as individuals. But it wasn't just about the game. It was about breaking down the walls. And little by little, it started to work. Noah and Tommy, they weren't friends. But Tommy stopped pushing back so much. The other boys began trusting Noah, not just as a teammate, but as a leader. And Kyle and Martin. They started to believe that maybe, just maybe, they belonged in this town too. Then, one night, everything changed. The fire. Jack woke to the smell of smoke. At first, he thought it was a dream. Then he heard the crackling. He shot out of bed. His heart pounded as he ran down the hallway, toward the boys' rooms. Noah, Kyle, Martin. All three were still asleep. Jack's voice boomed through the house. G-E-T-P. Get up, now. The boys jerked awake, coughing as smoke thickened in the air. Jack grabbed Kyle and Martin, rushing them toward the back door. Noah followed, his eyes wide with terror. The second they got outside, Jack turned. The garage was on fire. Flames licked at the walls, hungry, devouring. And there, painted across the side, a message, one that made Jack's blood turn ice cold. Leave. Jack felt rage unlike anything he had ever known. The fire department arrived, neighbors gathering outside. But Jack barely heard them, because as he looked at his sons, scared, shaken, but alive, he realized something. This wasn't just about them anymore. This town was never going to accept them. So they had two choices: run or fight. Jack turned to Noah. What do you want to do, son? Noah's hands clenched into fists. And when he spoke, his voice was stronger than Jack had ever heard it. We stay. Jack nodded. Then we fight. And as the fire burned behind them, Jack knew this was just the beginning. When the fire settled, the war began. The flames raged through the night, consuming everything inside Jack's garage. The workbench, the tools, the birdhouses Noah had built, the shelves he had planned to install in the boys' rooms. By the time the fire department put it out, there was nothing left but ashes. Jack stood there, his fists clenched at his sides, his chest rising and falling with quiet fury. He had lived in Maplewood for 30 years. He had built homes for half the people in this town. He had never hurt anyone. And yet, someone had tried to burn his family out. The investigation that went nowhere. The next morning, Jack sat in his half-burned backyard, drinking a cup of coffee that tasted like anger and exhaustion. A police officer, Sergeant Donaldson, stood across from him, not bothering to take notes. No cameras, no witnesses, Donaldson said, adjusting his belt. We'll investigate, but fires like this don't always have clear answers. Jack stared at him. A message was spray-painted on my garage. Donaldson shrugged. Could have been kids. Could have been anyone, really. Jack's fingers tightened around his coffee mug. Someone tried to scare my family out of town. Well, Donaldson said, exhaling, I can't tell you what to do, but if I were in your shoes, I'd think long and hard about whether staying here is worth it. Jack's grip turned white-knuckle. He set his coffee down before he shattered the mug. Let me make something clear, Jack said, his voice low, steady, dangerous. We're not leaving. Donaldson held his gaze for a moment, then sighed. I'll file the report. But Jack already knew the truth. Nothing was going to happen. The town had already made its decision. The breaking point. Jack thought the fire was the worst of it. But the town wasn't done yet. It started with small things. The grocery store suddenly stopped stocking his favorite coffee. The hardware store ran out of nails, but only when he was the one buying them. Kyle's teacher stopped calling on him in class. Martin's soccer coach kept him on the bench. And then, one day, Noah came home with blood on his shirt. Jack dropped the hammer he'd been holding. What happened? Noah didn't answer. His silence was like a knife. Kyle and Martin stayed quiet too, their faces dark with something Jack had seen too many times before. Fear. Jack's heart pounded. He turned back to Noah. Son, tell me what happened. Noah exhaled sharply through his nose. Some guys jumped me after practice. Jack went still. Who? Noah didn't answer. Kyle swallowed. It was Tommy and his friends. Jack's blood ran hot. Noah crossed his arms, jaw tight. "It's fine." "No, it's not," Jack said, his voice sharp. Noah looked at him then, his dark eyes burning. "If I fight back, they'll say I'm the problem. If I don't, they win. So tell me, Dad, what am I supposed to do?" Jack had never felt so helpless. He had built roofs to shelter people from the rain, walls to keep families safe. But how the hell was he supposed to protect his boys from an entire town? Jack inhaled deeply. Then he made a decision. He wouldn't go to the police. He wouldn't go to the school. He was going to fix this himself. A storm brewing. That night, Jack drove to Tommy Peterson's house. The Petersons were Maplewood royalty, old money, landowners, people who thought their blood was better than everyone else's. Jack pounded on the door. It opened, and Tommy's father, Richard Peterson, stepped outside. "Jack," he said smoothly, leaning against the doorframe. "What brings you here?" Jack got right to the point. "Your boy put his hands on my son." Richard arched an eyebrow. "And?" Jack's fists clenched. "You need to handle this, Richard, or I will." Richard laughed. Not a real laugh. A mocking, slow chuckle. "You think you can waltz in here and tell me what to do?" Jack didn't flinch. "I think your son's a coward. And I think you raised him that way." Richard's smile vanished. Jack stepped closer. "You tell Tommy to stay away from my boys, or I promise you, this town is going to see a side of me they don't like." Silence. Then Richard smirked. "You don't belong here, Jack. You and those boys. You're fighting a battle you can't win." Jack exhaled slowly. "We'll see about that." Then he turned and walked away. The moment that changed everything. The next morning, Jack pulled up to Maplewood High School. The parking lot was packed. There was a basketball game that night, the first of the season. Jack watched the boys pile out of the truck. Noah's shoulders were stiff. Kyle and Martin kept their heads down. Jack clenched his fists. This was it. The town wanted them to be afraid, to leave, to give up. Instead, Jack did something bold. He walked right into the school, straight into the main hallway. And there, standing in front of every student, every teacher, every damn person who had ever doubted his family, he pulled out a drill and hung up a brand new plaque on the wall. The plaque read, "Henderson scholarship for students who show courage, integrity, and strength." Beneath it, a photo of Noah, Kyle, and Martin. The hallway went silent. Then, slowly, whispers spread. Noah's eyes widened. Kyle grinned. Martin beamed. Jack turned to the crowd of students. "My family isn't going anywhere." Then he walked out, head high, shoulders back. That night, his boys played their first basketball game. And when Noah made the winning shot, the entire town had no choice but to cheer. Because, like it or not, the Hendersons weren't just here to stay. They were here to win. When the dust settled, they stood taller. Jack Henderson had never been the kind of man to back down from a fight. He had fought poverty as a young contractor trying to build a name for himself. He had fought grief when he lost his wife and the dreams they had built together. And now he was fighting an entire town, not with fists, but with something even more powerful. Unshakable resolve. The night of the basketball game, Jack sat in the stands, arms crossed, watching as his boys stepped onto the court. He wasn't just watching a game. He was watching a war. And tonight, they weren't playing to win a trophy. They were playing to prove they belonged. The game that changed everything. The Maplewood Panthers had always been a team of legacies. Sons of old money, grandsons of former state champions, boys who had never struggled for acceptance because it was given to them at birth. But tonight, everything was different. Tonight, a Henderson was on the court. Noah stood at center court, facing off against Tommy Peterson, the same kid who had tormented him for weeks. The referee blew the whistle. The ball launched into the air. And in that split second, Noah jumped higher. Higher than Tommy. Higher than the doubts. Higher than every ugly whisper that had followed him through the hallways of Maplewood High. The crowd gasped. Jack grinned. Because for the first time, this town was seeing his son for what he really was. Not a kid who didn't belong. A damn good player. The game was brutal. Tommy and his teammates played dirty, elbows in ribs, shoves when the refs weren't looking. But Noah, he didn't break. Jack watched as his son took every hit and kept going. Kyle, smaller but faster, darted between defenders like a shadow. And Martin, the youngest, sat on the bench waiting for his moment. Then, the final quarter. The score was tied. Jack felt his heart pounding. This was it. And in that moment, everything slowed. Tommy had the ball. Noah blocked him. The ball flew loose. Martin, who had just been subbed in, caught it. Jack's breath caught. This was Martin's chance. This was his moment. Martin sprinted toward the basket, the whole court watching. Tommy raced after him. And then, Martin jumped. For a second, it was like time had stopped. Jack could see the doubt in Martin's face, the fear that he wasn't good enough. But then, Jack saw something else. Determination. Martin slammed the ball through the hoop, his small hands gripping the rim before dropping down. The buzzer screamed. The crowd exploded. Jack leaped to his feet, pride swelling in his chest. Because tonight, his boys hadn't just won a game. They had won their place in this town. The aftermath. Jack expected resistance. He expected the whispers, the cold shoulders, the lingering resentment. But what he didn't expect was the change. The day after the game, Jack walked into the grocery store, expecting the usual silent treatment. Instead, Mrs. Thompson, ***, the same woman who had once crossed the street to avoid him, ***, walked up to him with a carton of eggs. "Your boys played a hell of a game last night," she said, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. Jack blinked. "They did." She shifted, uncomfortable, then muttered, maybe I misjudged you." It wasn't an apology. But in Maplewood, it was close enough. One by one, the town began to change. The whispers grew quieter. The stares grew softer. And the boys. They stood taller. Kyle wasn't skipped over in class anymore. Martin wasn't ignored by his coach. And Noah wasn't just respected. He was feared. Because after that game, nobody doubted him anymore. Not his talent, not his strength, and definitely not his right to be here. The unexpected invitation. A few weeks later, something happened that Jack never expected. A letter arrived in the mail. It wasn't from the town. It wasn't from the school. It was from Richard Peterson. Jack sat at the kitchen table, the boys watching as he unfolded the letter with rough, calloused hands. "Mr. Henderson, you've made quite an impact on this town. Whether we like it or not, things are changing. I'd like to talk. Over dinner. Richard Peterson." Jack set the letter down. Kyle frowned. What does he want? Jack exhaled, rubbing his jaw. "I don't know, son, but we're going to find out." The dinner that shook Maplewood. The Peterson estate was a fortress. Massive white columns, manicured lawns, a house that had stood for 4 generations. Jack walked in with his boys at his side. Inside, Richard sat at the head of a long dining table, flanked by his wife and Tommy. The air was thick with tension. Jack didn't sit. He crossed his arms and stared Richard down. "Why are we here?" Richard sighed, sipping his whiskey. "Because things are changing, and I'd rather be ahead of the change than left behind." Jack raised an eyebrow. "You're saying you want to work together?" Richard smirked. "I'm saying I'd rather shake your hand than fight a losing battle." Jack exhaled slowly. This wasn't acceptance. It wasn't friendship. It was surrender. And in its own way, It was a victory. Jack reached out, and for the first time in his life, Richard Peterson shook the hand of a Henderson. The legacy of the Henderson name. Years later, when people talked about Maplewood, they didn't talk about how it used to be. They talked about the Hendersons, about the contractor who wouldn't leave, about the three boys who refused to back down, and about the night they changed everything. Because in the end, it wasn't about winning basketball games or earning a handshake from Richard Peterson. It was about proving that family isn't built by blood. It's built by love. And in a town that had tried to break them, the Hendersons had built something that would never be torn down. Not by whispers, not by fire, and not by hate. Because when the dust settled, they stood taller than anyone ever thought they could. The unbreakable family. Jack Henderson had always believed in hard work. He had spent decades building houses, pouring sweat into foundations, making sure every beam was strong enough to last generations. But nothing prepared him for building a family in a town that tried to tear it apart. He had fought. He had stood his ground. And somehow he had won. But now came the hardest part. Not just staying, but thriving. A town that finally saw them. The weeks after the basketball game felt different. Jack could feel it everywhere. At the grocery store, where Mrs. Thompson didn't just acknowledge him, she actually smiled. At church, where Mrs. Aldridge, the same woman who once whispered behind his back, walked up to him and said, "Your boys are fine young men, Jack. You should be proud." At school, where Kyle was finally being treated fairly, where Martin wasn't left on the sidelines, where Noah walked through the halls without being followed by hateful whispers. It wasn't perfect. There were still some who looked at them and saw outsiders. But for the first time, Jack didn't care. Because now, they weren't just surviving. They were living. The unexpected invitation. Jack was in the garage, his newly rebuilt garage, working on a table when Kyle ran in, breathless. "Dad, look at this." Jack wiped his hands on a rag and took the crumpled letter. His eyes skimmed the words. Then he froze. "Dear Mr. Henderson, on behalf of the Maplewood High School Committee, we are pleased to inform you that Noah Henderson has been selected as one of the recipients of the Maplewood Community Scholarship for his leadership, resilience, and impact on the student body. We would be honored if you and your family would attend the award ceremony this Friday evening." Jack stared at the paper, blinking. Noah, his Noah, was being honored by the same town that once tried to run them out. His grip on the letter tightened. Kyle bounced on his heels. "Dad, this is huge. Noah's gonna freak out when he hears." Jack swallowed the lump in his throat. "Yeah, son, he sure will." The moment everything changed. Friday came faster than Jack expected. The school's auditorium was packed. Jack sat in the front row, his hands clasped together, watching as Noah walked onto the stage. For a moment, it felt unreal. This was the same boy who, just months ago, had been jumped outside this very school. The same boy who had walked these halls with his head down, trying not to be noticed. But tonight, he stood tall. Principal Warner cleared his throat. "Noah Henderson has shown us what true perseverance looks like. He has taken every challenge thrown his way and turned it into a victory, not just on the basketball court, but in life." Jack saw Noah's hands tremble slightly as he took the award. But then, he turned to face the audience. And when he spoke, his voice was clear, strong. "I never thought this town would accept me." The auditorium fell silent. Noah looked at Jack, at Kyle, at Martin, then back at the crowd. "When my brothers and I came here, we were just 3 scared kids. We lost everything. Our home, our parents, and we thought we'd lost our future too." Jack's chest tightened. Noah took a deep breath. "But then we met someone who refused to let us give up. Someone who took us in when no one else would. Someone who taught us that family isn't about blood. It's about love. About showing up, even when it's hard. About never letting hate win. Noah turned to Jack. Our dad taught us that. Jack inhaled sharply. His vision blurred. Noah looked back at the crowd. This award isn't just mine. It's his too. Because without him, I wouldn't be standing here today. The auditorium erupted in applause. Jack, a man who had spent his life holding back emotion, felt a tear slide down his cheek, and when Noah stepped off the stage and wrapped his arms around him, Jack held his son like he never wanted to let go. Because for the first time, Noah finally knew. He belonged. The road ahead. The next morning, Jack woke up to the smell of bacon. He frowned. Kyle and Martin were sitting at the kitchen table grinning. Noah stood at the stove, flipping pancakes. Jack leaned against the doorway, crossing his arms. What's this? Noah shrugged. Figured it was time I did something for you. Jack chuckled. You know, kid, you almost burned down the house last time you tried to cook. Noah smirked. I learned from my mistakes. Jack pulled up a chair, watching as Noah set a plate in front of him. For a moment, he just sat there, taking it all in. The laughter, the warmth, the love that filled every corner of this house. They had been through hell, but they had come out stronger. Jack picked up his fork and took a bite. Noah watched him expectantly. Jack chewed, swallowed, then grunted. Not bad. Kyle snorted. Dad, just admit it. It's good. Jack sighed dramatically. Fine. It's good. Noah beamed. Damn right, it is. Jack shook his head, hiding his smile behind his coffee cup. Because in that moment, he realized something. They weren't just a family fighting to survive. They were a family that had won. And no amount of whispers, fires, or prejudice could ever take that away. Not now. Not ever. Epilogue. The legacy of the Hendersons. Years later, people didn't talk about how Maplewood used to be. They talked about the Hendersons, about the man who refused to give up on 3 boys, about the family who stood their ground, and about the moment this town changed forever. Because when people looked back, they didn't just see outsiders. They saw a legacy, a family that built something unbreakable, and a father who had proved that love is the strongest foundation of all. The unbreakable family. Jack Henderson had spent most of his life laying foundations, but nothing, not a single house he had ever built, was as strong as the one he had built with Noah, Kyle, and Martin. For the first time in years, peace had settled over his family. The town wasn't perfect. There were still some people who would never change. But that didn't matter anymore. Because Jack had stopped trying to fit in. He and his boys had carved out their own space, and they had done it on their own terms. One last test. It was a Sunday morning when Jack realized that true acceptance wasn't just about what people said. It was about what they did. The boys were outside, shooting hoops in the driveway, while Jack worked on fixing the porch railing. He was halfway through when he heard a car pull up. Jack turned, wiping sweat from his forehead, and froze. Standing at the edge of his driveway was Richard Peterson, Tommy's father, a man who had spent months trying to make Jack's life hell. Jack exhaled slowly, setting down his drill. "What do you want, Richard?" Richard hesitated, shoving his hands into his pockets. "I heard Noah was heading to college soon." Jack crossed his arms. "Yeah, got a scholarship. Full ride." Richard nodded, glancing toward the driveway. The boys had stopped playing, watching silently. Kyle and Martin were tense, but Noah looked right at Richard. No fear, no hesitation, just calm confidence. Jack felt a surge of pride. This kid had come so damn far. Richard exhaled, rubbing his chin. "Tommy's going to the same school." Jack said nothing. Richard sighed. Then he pulled something from his pocket. Jack stiffened as Richard held out his hand. A small white envelope. Jack frowned. "What's this?" Richard's jaw tightened, something I should have given a long time ago. Jack hesitated, then took the envelope. Inside was a check, a donation to the Henderson Family Community Scholarship. Jack's throat tightened, not because of the money, but because of what it meant. Richard Peterson, one of the most powerful men in town, was finally admitting he had been wrong. Jack stared at him. Why now? Richard looked at the boys. At Noah, standing tall. At Kyle, arms crossed but watching. At Martin, gripping the basketball like he was waiting for an answer. And then Richard sighed. Because whether I like it or not, your family's part of this town now. He turned to Noah. Good luck, kid. Then, he got back in his car and drove away. Jack stood there, the envelope in his hands, as the boys walked up to him. Kyle peered over his shoulder. Was that a check? Jack nodded. A big one. Noah frowned. You gonna keep it? Jack smirked. Then, he ripped it in half. The boys' jaws dropped. Dad, that was free money. Jack chuckled, shaking his head. We don't need his money. Noah's eyes lit up with understanding. Because they had already won. And no check. Asterisk, asterisk, no amount of money in the world. Asterisk, asterisk was worth trading away their pride. A new beginning. The day Noah left for college was one of the hardest days of Jack's life. He had raised this boy, watched him grow from a kid who kept his head down into a leader. And now he was sending him out into the world. The morning was quiet. Jack helped load the last suitcase into the truck. Noah stood beside him, staring at the house, the home they had built together. Jack exhaled. You ready, son? Noah didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to Jack and hugged him. Jack froze. Noah had never been the hugging type. But now he held on tight. And Jack hugged him back. Thank you, Noah whispered. Jack swallowed the lump in his throat. For what? Noah pulled back, his eyes bright. For saving my life. Jack blinked, caught off guard. Noah. But Noah shook his head. You didn't just give me a home, Dad. You gave me a future. Jack felt his heart swell. He ruffled Noah's hair, his voice rough. Well, don't screw it up, all right. Noah grinned. No promises. Jack chuckled, and then watched as his son climbed into the truck. Watched as he drove toward his future. Watched as he left, not as a boy who once felt like an outsider, but as a Henderson. Epilogue. The family that changed everything. Years later, people didn't talk about how Maplewood used to be. They talked about the Hendersons, about the contractor who refused to leave, about the 3 boys who refused to back down, about the basketball game that changed everything, and about the moment the town finally saw them as family. Jack never built another house after that, because he had already built the most important one, a home, one that no one could take away. And in the end, that was the greatest legacy of all.